Yeah, it's this classic example where I don't know where I read this, where I saw this, where they said like a web page is inherently accessible, but we then add stuff to it to make it inaccessible. So it's it's being aware of when you add that line. I think that's when um, that moment comes in where the shift left thing comes in, where you just stop and say, I'm about to do this thing. Do we really need this? And if we do, how can we do this in a way that we're not excluding somebody, a group of people?
Yeah, I love saying that about performance as well. Like the web is fast by default. If you just ship HTML, it's really fast. If you add lots of CSS and JavaScript and images and video, it'll be slower. It's the case with a lot of things, and it shows that like how much of our actions actually influence the quality of what we produce. We could stop doing certain things and then make better products.
My name is Skulk Netling, and this is the Mechanical Ink podcast, a podcast about open source, the open web, sustainability, and those who want to make the web and the world a better place. Hey, Hidde, and welcome to the Mechanical Ink podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
It's a big pleasure. We've talked about this one for some time, but it's always so hard to get everybody's schedules and calendars on the same day and at the same time and the same place. But thankfully, we have this remote thing now that we can do, so it makes it a little bit easier, sometimes harder, but normally, but easier. So yeah, thanks again for joining. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It's about a topic that's dear to my heart. But before we dig into any of the specifics, I would love for you to just tell us about who is Hidde and what do you do for your day job and just what makes you get up in the morning?
Awesome. Yeah, I'm a web developer from Rotterdam, the Netherlands. I started out as a developer and I kind of changed into more of a teacher of development in a way. Like I started doing more workshops and talks and things like that. And now my day job is pretty much communications, like technical communications usually. And currently it's general communication. So I'm the public relations lead at the NL Design System project at the Dutch government, where I try to explain what we do to lots of different audiences. So anyone from like people actually building websites to more like management who are also somehow involved with this project because they need to send people to the project and contribute, and it's all open source. So we're this one big open source community. And yeah, I'm passionate about web standards and the web and web accessibility as well. And I like talking, writing, reading about all of that.
Amazing. I didn't know that the design system was like a complete open source thing. Do you want to like dig into that a little bit more? Give us some. You're the public relations person, right? So you get to do a little bit of your job here.
I would be the best one to ask. No, this is a project that was kind of conceived because we realized that so many government departments are making their own websites and kind of inventing their own wheels, which is kind of the thing everyone says when they talk about a design system, right? We don't want to reinvent wheels. We see a lot of wheels being invented sort of everywhere in the government, but we also saw a lot of challenges that a lot of these government departments have, like legislation that applies to them. One of which being the European accessibility legislation that applies in Europe and all of the government agencies need to apply to. And we've got standards for that that I love, like the WCAG standard and all of those. But very often people don't get the practical consequences of the WCAG standard so well because they're not as easy as it seems, right? So the way that it's described in the standard document is usually quite general. And across all of these different government departments, people realized, well, we don't really know how to actually do this in practice or, find it hard to actually apply the guidelines. So what we're trying to do is basically bring everyone's efforts together and they could be design system efforts already. But what we're trying to do is have one sort of open source library of components, as well as guidelines, as well as patterns that people can use and share. And then we have a quality assurance process that all of these kind of components go through, which in the end would result in patterns that are tested with users and that meet the guidelines and all of that. That's all the way at the end, the last stage. But within this 4-stage process, the first one is just someone makes a component, and between those first and the fourth stages, we kind of optimize the component to be some more generalized and be better researched and all of that. So we basically have a process to have everyone in government contribute the things that they need, and then ultimately we hope to end up with almost a standard of components that people can then reuse within government and kind of safely use as well if they want to meet this follow the legislation that applies to them, and meet user needs, which is kind of the first goal of it, right? We share user research and accessibility research just to make sure that it's as easy as possible to make digital services that are accessible and user friendly. And that's, like I said, it's easier said than done. There are standards and they're great, but kind of to make that more concrete and more practical and applicable, we try and bring the best minds together and make like the greatest hits of all the government design systems that exist in this country, which is in the hundreds, I think. Like there are lots of different departments that all have their design systems, but we're trying to kind of get everyone to kind of go through the same process, same open source license, same kind of way of working, and then have their own things that they still need, right? Like brand guidelines and in general, like every organization has their own brand and they need to kind of keep that. So big effort.
It is, it is an amazingly big effort. I mean, to do this at a single company is often, like months and months of work. So doing this across an entire government, it's a big undertaking. But I'm always blown away by the fact that, and it seems like it's a European thing, because I'm thinking Sovereign Tech Fund in Germany, right? Like this is like their focus on open source and funding and all of that kind of thing. But, the fact that the Dutch government and the government in the Netherlands, that they have the foresight to think and ensure there's legislation that plays into this, but still, to have the foresight to see this as important and to do this as an open source thing that essentially everybody can benefit from it's amazing. It's so impressive, because often when I see that kind of thing, like, oh, this and that person is working for a government project, I'm like, oh, that must suck. But then, because I think about the government in South Africa, and like, I don't see them spearheading anything like this that I would want to be involved in, right? So that is where, like, it's a classic example of my viewpoint being different from yours. When you see it, you're like, oh, that's interesting. For me, it's like, oh, that must be horrible.
Yeah, it's not always easy, but it's worth the effort if we kind of imagine what the end state could look like. I should note, by the way, I'm a contractor to the government, so I don't speak on behalf of, et cetera, et cetera. Many of us in the team are, and we work for the government to try and help them get this off the ground. But yeah, open source is important, I think, for this project specifically, because a lot of consultant money is kind of spent in government circles. And it's obviously creative that money doesn't have to be spent on lots of different organizations. But if that knowledge kind of gets to be reusable by default,
yeah, makes a lot of sense. So how do people get involved if they want to get involved? Is it just like GitHub and you find the org and you see what's available and grab something?
We've got organizations to contribute the things that they need. So we have like one city that is working on, and now I'm going to try and translate some complex Dutch words into English. They're basically working on some place where citizens can apply for a permit. I can't remember what the permit would be called in English, but they have that project. They get involved with us. They hear that we are doing this NL design system project, and they might show up to what we call a design open hour and then discuss with other designers how maybe they would approach it. So do some knowledge sharing there. They might actually build some front end components, but if they do that, they would kind of do that within our org and then get design tokens and stuff like that for their organization if they don't exist yet. So they could contribute as developers or as designers. Often it's a bit of both. And yeah, even as guidelines or reviewers. And sometimes we have people just show up to the like open hours and the open meetings to discuss very specific stuff like pagination, or like what if you have a 5-step process and you want to do error handling? How do you approach it? And that's traditionally been quite tricky to kind of contribute to those kind of problems across governments, because governments used to be more siloed and they still are. But what we find is, because we're kind of a bottom-up initiative, is that people really like being in the same room together, and they might have a team of 2 designers in their own org and get to chat to government designers elsewhere. Is inspiring. I often attend these from my accessibility specialism point of view, to try and help with that, because they often have accessibility related questions as well. So we kind of work on those together, or we figure out maybe we need to do some user research here. And then one org might decide they will actually host that. So my team, like the core team, doesn't actually do a lot of that work. Like we don't do user tests ourselves usually. We don't build components ourselves. We don't write guidelines ourselves officially. We still do write some. But the idea is that every organization does those things. So they write components or they write guidelines and they contribute them and kind of review them as well. So we kind of, as the core team, we arrange for this community to exist and kind of do the community management and make sure that people have the prerequisites, difficult word, that they have that in place. So like there's an example repo on GitHub, and there is all sorts of kind of code management. Like we've got this Terraform thing that we're playing around with now to manage access rights and stuff like that. So there's a lot of plumbing and stuff that we try to make sure exists, and or meetings to be organized and stuff like that. But the work actually happens at the organization themselves with the stuff that they need. And then we try and identify that multiple organizations maybe need the same thing, which is often the case. Like a lot of cities in the Netherlands have the same, they all have a passport application form. Every single Dutch city, which is hundreds of them. So if one of them builds it, if the city of Amsterdam builds one, then the city of Rotterdam, where I live, can steal it. And we want them to steal each other's stuff, especially if they worked on it so hard, and then they can focus on other problems. Yeah.
That's amazing. I love that. That's like pure open source, right? Collaborative, like everybody benefiting from one another. And it plays into the whole accessibility thing as well, which is the classic curb cut effect, where you do something thinking it's only for a certain part of the population, but then it positively impacts other people. There's so many examples of it, the curb cut effect being one of the classic ones. But to do a bit of a broader step back, like 2 weeks ago, so I wrote a post where I just said like why web accessibility or digital accessibility is important to me and why other people should care as well. But this podcast is not about me, it's about you. So you want to tell us like, why is web accessibility important to you?
It's a big question. Like I feel like it's the same, it's kind of changed across the time that I was involved with accessibility. So I think one of the very first web projects I got to work on had accessibility requirements, and I kind of just naturally followed them. And then I realized a lot of the work in accessibility is in what sort of HTML is written and like what sort of code is involved. So I realized how much influence we have as developers or as people making websites on, how people can actually use the stuff that we make. So user experience has always been very important. And once I kind of learned about how people with disabilities use the web and what kind of problems exist on websites, I couldn't stop but wanting to fix those problems because they seem like they're not that hard to fix. I mean, some of them are, right? That's why we have the whole design system thing, and we want to solve hard problems. But there are a lot of, like, if you look at the Web 8 million, there's a lot of low hanging fruit, and it's kind of a natural thing for me to try and pick that fruit. Like, there's just a lot of things that we could make better about our own websites. So yeah, I care about it. And yeah, obviously, it's an equality issue. We've got to make sure that the web works for everyone. It's Tim Berners-Lee thing. He said that we need to do that. It was how the web was invented, so it kind of feels very natural to try and make sure that's the case. It's a really interesting field to work in.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think yeah, it's like it's kind of our responsibility as makers on the web to ensure that the things we make can reach as many people as possible. Because I've seen so many situations where it's like this classic situation of technology should have solved this problem. And it probably did, but the reason these people still have to go through this whole arduous analog process is because the systems is not accessible to them. Whether that be it's convoluted and complex more so than it needs to be, which is kind of like a user experience aspect, or whether it's simply people didn't consider that, not everybody uses a mouse, not everybody has perfect sight and all these kinds of things. So yeah, so when you start thinking about it that way, you're like, okay, I think I talked about something similar to this. I think it was about security, this whole idea of shift left, and where people were saying, but aren't we just putting more and more responsibility on the developer? And that's one way of looking at it. But I think what we kind of came to is it's not so much about the doing, it's about how you think about a thing. It's more about when you're about to build something, just stopping for a moment and thinking like, the choices I'm making here could potentially include or exclude people. Let me focus on ensuring that I include as many people as possible as opposed to excluding people by the choices that I make. And then from there, it's more like your normal day to day. You just take a moment to think about it a little more.
It's the kind of like once you know that there is a problem with a certain pattern, then it's really hard not to do it, right? But once you know about what causes exclusion, it's hard not to. Like, I think most people wouldn't want to exclude people on purpose. They just don't know that they're excluding people, and yeah, that's, I think, a really powerful way as well to teach accessibility, to explain, like, if your website does X, Y, or Z, then that excludes these people. Then once you know, it's really hard to not kind of take that into account when you're doing the work.
Yeah. Bit of a hot topic that's been discussed a lot, and I basically just like to know your thoughts around it. I've read some of them, so yeah. But so the accessibility overlays. A lot of people like this whole idea of you give us money, we stick this thing on your website, and voila, anybody can use your website. And of course, there's a lot of people, some people in the community who's been to court for this, saying the wrong thing. Saying the right thing, but people not liking it. So, with that in mind, also say as much as you feel comfortable saying, sharing just your thoughts around accessibility overlays.
Yeah, I love the idea of trying to make websites better and maybe automating some of that. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. Especially, like I said, there's a lot of low hanging fruit on websites, and like the Web 8 million top issues on websites are often issues that are easy to fix and that maybe could automatically be fixed. So part of the reason for that is that the survey was done with automated tools. So it is the kind of thing that's automatically testable, that's also automatically fixable. All of this to say, yeah, cool to try and have automated fixes, but maybe you can feel the thought coming here. Like, it's you can't automatically fix a lot of problems, and there's a bunch of products that are marketed as accessibility overlays that say they will make your website WCAG compliant, or they say they will fix accessibility barriers, but they don't. Now that's a big problem, and I think in general, if we look at what's technologically possible, there isn't a lot of things that could automatically be fixed. So the current set of overlays that exist, they don't work. And I won't name specific products because I haven't analyzed each specific one of them, but I've seen a number of them claim that they can give you WCAG compliance or that they can guarantee WCAG compliance, and that's not how any of this works. Like a lot of accessibility problems can only be found manually. It's really hard to claim those kind of things. I'm a signatory of that overlay fact sheet, and I recommend anyone looking at it as well. It's overlayfactsheet.com, and they have a lot of information on like how exactly some of these overlay products are wrong and not helping users, and sometimes making things worse as well. They've been known to do that, and that's a problem. There's another type of overlay that I find very interesting, and I started a community group for at the W3C a few years ago. We stopped this group because we didn't really have the time to continue it. But the idea of that was to put features into browsers that would then fix accessibility problems automatically. So from the set of problems that we knew we could fix automatically, we were going to write up a bunch of them that could do that. I have a conference talk somewhere as well that goes into that. It's things like color contrast. If there's two colors, you can automatically test if they have sufficient contrast. You can also put like a backplate behind the text with a color that does have sufficient contrast. Like that kind of stuff could be calculated. So it seems to me that that kind of problem doesn't have to exist. Like it could automatically be fixed by a tool like that. And what I mean by the fixing is basically to make sure that users aren't at the mercy of web developers or web designers. Not as a replacement for them doing their job, because they should do their job and make sure the website's good in the first place, but basically to offer more options to users to use the content to access what that content is. And there's a bunch of other things where we could try and automatically fix some issues or kind of address issues in content. And I think that's a more fruitful approach. Not claiming full WCAG compliancy, of course. More like there is these 5-6 things that the browser could probably help with. And there's a bunch of features already in browsers as well. Like focus indicators is a good example. The default focus indicator could be very good. It could have an optional extra visible version of it, for instance. That's something that I think could be quite powerful, because then no one is at the mercy of individual web designers designing focus indicators. You want to know where the focus is, the browser could show you in whatever way you wanted. There's a few things I think that the browsers could do at the browser level, and that way it could also be interoperable with assistive technologies and with websites, even if there's a standard for it.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense for it to be, if anywhere, for it to be straight up in the user agent, as opposed to anywhere else. Like that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, I think like it makes total sense if it's going to be fixed. I'm putting quotes here if you're listening in audio. If any of those things will be fixed automatically, the browser makes the most sense as the target for doing this. Now, I know that there's been some people that have talked about, as you've said, there's this low-hanging fruit. Maybe there's a little bit more, even if you introduce AI into the mix. So I have a couple of questions around the whole AI thing. So I think maybe let's talk about the first one, which is this: like, does AI open avenues that we before haven't had for these automated kind of identification of things and then automatically addressing them in the browser?
Yeah, probably. Like I think AI tools can recognize things that websites don't identify themselves, which could be useful. There's a couple of things that like language models are very good at, like transcribing text, for instance. I do this a lot when I upload a talk to YouTube and it does like an automated captioning. I usually only have to take out a few problems, and then it's a really good starting point for me doing my own captions. And it's really fantastic, I think, how some of that can benefit. I also see a lot of claims that AI could maybe automatically fix accessibility, which I guess it's a bit of a theme, right? Every time I see the automated fixing of accessibility, yeah, my eyebrows go up, because that's probably not something that could actually be done, not in the way that that they say they can, and not as a replacement for requirements of, for instance, governments, and soon in the EU it will also be other types of companies that need to comply with accessibility legislation. Yeah, they can't just throw AI at it. That's probably not a good idea.
Why do you think we are still stuck in this conversation about wanting to retroactively fix accessibility? Like, I get it, there's a bunch of old websites on the internet, right? That's like, there's maybe not even people maintaining them anymore. They just happen to be on some free tier of some hosting company and they just live on. And for some people, there might be useful content there. And so, there's a reason for you to retroactively fix. But I feel like if we keep talking about addressing accessibility as an afterthought that you then have to fix and then find tools to do it for you so you don't have to do the work.
Yeah,
I feel like we're working in the wrong direction, because like we talked about earlier, if you know how to do it the right way, then it's hard for you to do it the wrong way. So shouldn't we focus more on educating developers and saying, this is how you do a hamburger menu or whatever you want to call it, in an accessible way. And instead of saying, how can we retroactively fix the things we break, how can we not break them in the first place, maybe?
yeah, and I think it kind of stems from the wrong understanding of kind of where the problem lies when it comes to accessibility. There's a distinction between the medical and the social model of accessibility, where the medical model kind of sees users with disabilities as problematic, or the problem is within the user and it needs fixing. Whereas the social model looks at the same problem a different way, being that users aren't the problem, but the world around them is the problem. So the world disables them. And that would be websites too, right? So if websites have barriers in them, it's the website's problem. They are disabling users from doing the thing that they want to be doing. And I think that's once you kind of see that difference, those two different ways of, and there's different models and also ones that kind of try and combine them. But if you look at it kind of with the social lens, then it makes a lot of sense to try and fix it from the website perspective. It's a website problem. You could make a website that has no problems for lots of different users to use, or you could create one that very specifically only works for people who have specific traits. And that's kind of your job to get right. And a lot of the accessibility legislation obviously follows that social model as well. The world's got to be better, not the people.
Yeah, it's this classic example where I don't know where I read this, where I saw this, where they said like a web page is inherently accessible, but we then add stuff to it to make it inaccessible. So
Yeah,
it's being aware of, when you add that line. I think that's when that that moment comes in where the shift left thing comes in, where you just stop and say, I'm about to do this thing. Do we really need this? And if we do, how can we do this in a way that we're not excluding somebody, a group of people?
yeah. I love saying that about performance as well. Like the web is fast by default. If you just ship HTML, it's really fast. If you add lots of CSS and JavaScript and images and video, it'll be slower. It's the case with a lot of things, and it shows that like how much of our actions actually influence the quality of what we produce. We could stop doing certain things and then make better products.
Yeah, for sure. And then the other thing about AI that's concerning, and I've thought about it, like if there's a way, and I mean, surely there needs to be a way, but this needs also, I think this could also be a collective thing, like an open source initiative or community initiative or something, because there's a lot of people focusing on building AI Devons, for lack of a better word, that'll generate code, right? You give it a Figma design, it spits out the website. Now, it reminds me a lot of back in the day when we used to get a PNG or a JPEG, and then you'd cut it up in Photoshop and you'd, move that over, and then in Macromedia, you'll drag and drop things. But you'll never look at the source code because it's scary what's going on in there and how it actually gets this thing to look the way. So it almost feels to me like, and some of the code that I've seen definitely is multi-tiered nested divs, where it's like, first of all, we probably don't need all of them, and this is clearly a list. So I wonder two things, like how big of a problem is this going to be in the next million websites test? Like how much worse could this have gotten because people are generating stuff with AI? And then is there a way that one can do something proactively to improve these models to understand what is accessible and not accessible code and to guide it towards generating more? Because I don't think we're going to get away from people wanting to generate code with AI. So how do we make the AI? And I mean, I'm not expecting a concrete answer, of course, just like what you think about this. Like, how do we guide these models to generate better, more accessible code?
Yeah, I think one of the tricky things about making an LLM that could help with accessibility or could generate accessible code is that to build any LLM to be good at a certain subject requires you to teach it what that subject is like, and it needs lots of examples of doing it well. Now, that's something that is really hard with accessibility because there aren't that many websites that are very accessible. Like people sometimes ask me in these kinds of interviews, like, what is the most accessible website you know of? And I actually struggle to give good examples because there are not that many websites that I'm confidently going to say these are very good, which is kind of what you would need. So maybe you would need to employ accessibility specialists to sit in a room and like tag millions of websites and say exactly what's good and bad about them, and then maybe it could work like that. But then there are still some problems because these tools inherently hallucinate, so they make up stuff that could be false, and that is sometimes false, but not always, but sometimes. And that's the trick part, right? It's great that it can do it 90% well, but if you don't know where the 10% is that it gets it wrong, then you have wrong stuff in there, which is kind of the case in other websites as well that are not generated by that. But now you've automated your falsehoods, basically. And the other issue is that a lot of good accessibility is about intentions. So you say, I'm going to make this a button, or this is supposed to be this thing, or this image. I want it to represent this. This is what I mean with that. And intentions is something that cannot really be automated. So AIs do not have intentions. That is not like a thing that they do. They just have like input and output. It's statistical, it's mathematical. Like this is predicts the next word basically, and it looks like it's smart, but there's no smartness. It's just very good at predicting the next word basically. So it makes it magic, right? Because if I would think of a word predictor, I wouldn't think it can do the things that LMs have shown that they can do. Like they sound really smart and cool. So it's like magic. But when it comes to specifics, and accessibility is about getting all the nuance right and all the intentions, then that's a trick. And then the last part would probably be innovation, which is also difficult to get with these tools because they can only build on what they've learned before. So we're not gonna get to that new user interface that needs new semantics because it wouldn't come up with the new things. Maybe it would hallucinate them, but like the innovation also happens in like lots of user testing and then finding out new patterns. Which websites like gov.uk, they have this blog about how they are going to do the new password input or something like that. Or the Dutch government, we have this 5-digit code that you need to fill in if you log into different websites. Um, Figuring out how that can meet WCAG and how that works for users, that's a lot of user testing and a lot of things to get right. Which these LLMs aren't going to do because they can only predict words. So yeah, it's intentions, it's hallucinations, it's innovation that gets stuck. Um, yeah, and then I haven't even mentioned the environmental issues with AI, which are probably for a different episode of the podcast, but they are also problematic, right?
Yeah, yeah, which is great. I mean, that it solidifies this idea that irrespective of what a lot of people on social media would love you to believe, AI is not going to entirely replace humans. There's always going to be a need for that. The LLMs can maybe make us do things faster. It can take away some of the tedious things. It can do some of the obvious things. But when it comes to making decisions around a specific scenario, you're going to need a human to step in and say, okay, I'll take the wheel from here. Talking about the password thing, this is something that I've been curious about for a while. And I know where this comes from. I think I know where this comes from, but I don't know whether that's a good idea on the web. So, like you said, a lot of services these days, you maybe don't even need a password. You'll just type your email address and it'll send you an email. There's a whole discussion about that thing where with people with ADHD and that it takes you out of your context to a different context, and often you forget what you were doing. And by the time you get back, it says, oh, the code is now not valid anymore. But leaving that aside, now you have a 5-digit code. You go back to the website and it has 5 little blocks. Now, if you look at the HTML, more often than not, those are divs that when you paste, JavaScript picks those characters, splits them apart, and then sticks them into those divs and makes it look like it's inputs that was filled in. But then there's other websites that just uses an input field. Both work. The second one makes a lot more sense to me, and from my perspective is inherently a lot more accessible without the need for a bunch of JavaScript. Is there any is it just but it looks cool, or it came from mobile where the mobile device would pick up, you got a pin over SMS and it would autofill it so you don't even interact with that component? Is that, and it's just made its way to the web, the browser, the desktop? Or is it just one of those things where it looks cool? It looks better than just an input box.
Oh, I'm afraid it might be the last. It might just look cool. I've seen a hybrid as well where it's just one input field, but they use CSS to make 5 rectangles, which is interesting. There's a lot of edge cases you'll need to test. And I do find, though, that these often work quite well. I'm always surprised that it will paste my thing in and it actually spreads them over. I would expect it to break because I'm a cynic, right? I would be afraid that, oh, is this going to be one of those things? Do I need to manually type it? But yeah, I'm not sure if there is lots of user benefit to spreading them out to 5 different places. I guess it's a little bit easier to remember or see what you're doing if they are separated and you're typing the code manually. Like with credit cards, that they spread out the 4-digit parts. That's kind of helpful, I think.
Yeah, be interesting to know more about that. I've always meant to, but I've not tried to do it using not doing paste, but maybe even doing paste, but just kind of accessing the page with a screen reader and seeing what it tells me about where do I paste this thing in, because especially you leave the page, right? So your focus potentially has moved away from where you were last time. So will it detect when I come back to put focus where it needs to be so that the screen reader will tell me I'm expecting a 4-digit code, you can paste it here kind of deal. It'd be interesting to test that. I haven't tested that. Talking about that, so this talks about native stuff that you just get, the input field in HTML. You don't have to do anything fancy, or you can build this whole unique component that you have to build everything. So I kind of like HTML, but I think along with CSS, it's one of these things where a lot of people are like, I don't want to write CSS. It's complicated. I don't understand it. I don't want to care about it. And a lot of people feel the same about HTML, or they only learn 10% of the language and then they just go at it, and they're missing out on so much that the language offers them actually. And sometimes they overcomplicate their lives. Classic example is of somebody saying, I'm still trying to find a date component that I can use. It's yes, input type date. It's pretty good. So 2 things. One, do you agree that it's still a good idea to learn HTML? in 2024? And second, is there anything coming up in the language that has been recently added that you are excited about?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant idea to still learn HTML. It's also my number one advice to companies who want to get better at accessibility or making their product more accessible, is to really hire for that HTML expertise. If I've learned anything from like doing WCAG audits, so many of the issues that I write down are HTML problems. They're not all div and button problems. They often are, right? But they are HTML problems in general. Like one of the most common success criteria to fail in audits is 131, info and relationships. Pretty much all about HTML. It's about making sure the relationships that are there visually are also in your code. So if you have a list that you've marked it up as a list, or if you have a bunch of headings that they actually look like headings. So yeah, I think it's a good shortcut to get your accessibility right. I'm still excited about HTML. I think it's one of the most fun parts as well of the web, because it has so much built in and it provides for a lot of interoperability as well. Like there is just simple things like headings, for instance, in a web page can be browsed in various different ways with assistive technology. So yeah, I think it's really cool. I'm glad it's also being expanded. What I'm most looking forward to is more of ARIA moving into HTML or getting native HTML versions. I feel like ARIA's been useful in like innovating new components and things like that on the web platform. But I also feel it's quite hard to use it well, because there's a lot of things you need to worry about apart from the attributes that you add to HTML. Is like which attributes are you using together? Does any focus management need to happen? What kind of situations can you not use it in? And all of this kind of stuff is quite hard to get right. There is some guidance with the ARIA specification, but it's hard to know what kind of stuff is going to work well with users. And I feel like if it was built into HTML, it would be easier to get it right for web developers. And as much as I think web developers have the duty to get it right, I also feel like it makes sense to try and make it easier for them to get it right, to have components in HTML that do things for you. One of which I'm very excited about is the popover attribute that's been added to all of the major browsers now, which allows you to have an element that is on top of everything else. So it's in the top layer. Yeah, it does a bunch of accessibility things for you, such as focus management, keyboard management sometimes, and it does like the expanded state. So yeah, it's a pretty cool example, I think, of an attribute that has some of these considerations built in. But I can't wait to see a bunch more actually to come. And another one maybe is invokers. That's also something that might be coming to HTML. It's not, I don't think it's in any browsers yet, apart from behind flags maybe. But it allows you to tell one element that there is a relationship with another element. For instance, like tell a button that there's a dialog somewhere and that it needs to open it. So it gives you like an invoke target and an invoke action attribute. Yeah, I think that's a really cool API as well. I haven't played around enough with it apart from like the main use cases. So yeah, I look forward to exploring that one more as well.
Nice. So is this kind of like what we would use ARIA controls for today?
Yeah, except for that ARIA controls that only tells the browser or like an assistive tag that there is control happening, but you still need to do the controlling yourself, right? And with the invokers, I think you can, yeah, you also still need to say what it needs to do, right? You need to do the opening and closing, but you kind of set that, you set that relationship. So I think it would also do some of the keyboard accessibility for you there. So it can do a little bit more than ARIA. That's the thing often most misunderstood with ARIA, is that it kind of just says this is the semantic, but it doesn't actually add everything to make that a reality. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. It's like when you have ARIA expanded, And then when you interact with it with mouse, keyboard, doesn't matter, you as developer have the responsibility to flip this Boolean state, right, between true and false. Like that doesn't automatically happen. So whenever HTML can kind of, the web language, the standards can take that over, that makes it so much easier for the developer. Like you just say, this thing opens that thing. So when you click it, you take care of changing the Boolean state. So the screen reader knows, oh, this thing is now open. Okay, now it's closed.
Yeah. And there's like less foot guns, I guess, like less ways to get it wrong. Like I know about accessibility. I know some stuff about it, but I also get the state wrong. Like maybe I forgot to add this function somewhere, or like when you're working on a component, you can't be constantly looking at it through the accessibility lens. Like you have other lenses that you need to kind of change between. And that's when I get into audit mode, then I find all these problems, right? But when I get into, I'm just building this component mode, sometimes I don't think about the state of my area expanded attribute all the time. It's hard or easy to get it wrong, basically. And I think, having some of that abstracted away to the browser is really helpful. They can't do everything magically, right? So that's the nuance to make, and like also the guidance that would need to be written to make it clear to web developers. Like you're not gonna get everything for free, but it's gonna do the stuff that it can do.
Yeah, you do get a heck of a lot for free. Cool. Well, Hidde, this has been an amazing conversation. I wish we could just keep going and going. It's a topic I really love, and I know you do too. But I know also that you have to run for a train and still pack. So with that in mind, in closing, how can people find you and how can people support you in the work you do?
I have a blog. It's on hidde.blog. That's where my website is. I'm also on Mastodon. And I think on my blog you can buy me coffees. That's a feature I've built for people to support. But otherwise, like I just enjoy sort of contributing blog posts to this platform. Yeah.
Amazing. And that is a great blog. I was going to say you wrote a really good post about the popover and what it does for you from an accessibility perspective. I highly recommend people read that one, and I'll link it up in the show notes.
Thanks. Yeah, that one was many thanks to Scott O'Hara, who co-wrote it with me. It was basically a lot of him explaining it, me writing it down. But I'm really happy to have that out there because it's one of the things that I feel like is most often misunderstood. And yeah, I'm really happy we got to a post there to share.
Great stuff. Well, thanks so much, Hidde. Safe travels, and I'll speak to you in the interwebs. Have a good one.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Mechanical Inc. podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with your friends. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Have something to add? Continue the conversation on GitHub and join the community on Slack. Until the next one, keep all the things open.